and hit all of those nutritional bases without taking in 5,000 calories, because it's easy to get in too much carbs, much less a whole lot of fat when you're eating on nothing but fast food. So speaking of which, now we're going to talk about the joys of fat itself. Now, fat often gets demonized. A lot of people will look down on it or think it has some type of major negative health outcomes because you eat it. And it's really not that. Now, the big thing is it's not really going to help you with your performance acutely. Instead, it's more important with your recovery. So the long and short of it is fat's good for you. We should probably make sure we're thinking about the sources we're getting it from. And we're going to break into groups and kind of talk about the different classes of fatty acids and how those different classes in turn can have some overarching different effects, but it gets more importantly when we look at the individual fatty acids. So remember, fats are not a bad fuel source when we happen to be exercising, specifically at a moderate to low intensity. We've got a whole lot of it. Even someone who's relatively lean is still going to have more than enough body fat in them that they are actually going to be able to effectively walk to an ocean from here meaning Kentucky, simply because we've got a whole lot stored around the body. The key is our ability to break it down and break it down rapidly is not something that obviously you can be able to keep the pace when we go up higher in intensity. So as we're looking through the flow chart here, guys, TG, triglyceride, FA, fatty acid, and then obviously you guys can read glycerol, glucose, and IMTG, intramuscular triglycerides, very low density lipoproteins, VLDL, and lipoprotein lipase. So we're just trying to get those fats to leave the effectual adipose cells, get in the bloodstream, and get into the muscle. Glycerol can go to the liver and undergo gluconeogenesis, and then getting that fat into the muscle and specifically into the mitochondria, where it can be broken down aerobically. Because remember, we can only break down fats through aerobic metabolism. Now, how are we going to break down fat that happens to be in our fat cells? Well, simply put, we've got, remember, hormones on both sides that are both going to inhibit and enhance. Insulin being inhibiting towards the breakdown of triglycerides, epinephrine, norepinephrine, and glucagon, not really so much glucagon, growth hormone, definitely being important for activating what's known as hormone-sensitive lipase. And that's going to be very important for breaking those triglycerides down into 3 fatty acids and 1 glycerol, which in turn, that's going to go into the bloodstream. Most of it's going to actually be bound up to albumin, which has a number of sites that fatty acids can bind to. They have a different amount of strength, so to speak, but that's typically how it's going to be shifted. Otherwise, it can be bound up into those larger lipoproteins, which will be taken up by cells accordingly. So it's giving not just fatty acids, but also cholesterol. Now, remember, guys, once we go ahead and get into our metabolism of fatty acids, we can always go back into the form of fatty acids. So we can take, thanks to glycolysis, using alpha glycerol-phosphate, and then through esterification, increase the length of a fatty acid until eventually it will be brought back into a triglyceride and then broken down accordingly into the fatty acids of the glycerol. So, sorry, our cat is singing us its song of its people, which always makes me a little concerned. Now, once we get those fatty acids into the muscle cell, the major rate limiting part is going to be right here of your CPT1 and CPT2 transporters, CAT1, CAT2 transporters. This is where carnitine is really important. So notice we have our acetyl-CoA, which in turn, so that's the fatty acid, is going to now be bound up to carnitine, hence acetylcarnitine, and then we're going to go ahead and be able to ship it back through into the mitochondria. We can undergo beta oxidation, which chops off, remember, 2 of the carbons at a time, giving us individual acetyl-CoAs along with an FADH2 and an NADH, which in turn are obviously going to be going into the citric, or going into the electron transport chain, whereas the acetyl-CoA, you also get malonyl-CoA when you end up with an odd number of a 3, hence why you see this number, or malonyl-CoA, over here. And that's going to be the big part of getting those fatty acids into the cell. Now, you guys are familiar with glucose. Remember, it's the GLUT4 transporter. That's going to be getting it in specifically into muscle cells, where we have a number of different glucose transporters that are going to be very important on different types of tissue lines. But the ones we're interested in when it comes to muscle is GLUT4. Both exercise and insulin is going to cause more of these to come to the surface. Now, our intramuscular triglycerides are going to be stored as fatty droplets, which will literally be right next to the mitochondria. So it's not like they got to travel that far. And then once we have the activation of that hormone-sensitive lipase, that's how we're going to be able to break down those intramuscular triglyceride stores and be able to utilize them for energy. So effectively, just remember, we keep it's all right next to mitochondria. We can also bring it in from the bloodstream into the muscle cell itself. We need carnitine, so we're going to be able to ship this appropriately into the cells. And beta oxidation is that 4-step process where we're going to chop off 2 carbons at a time. So the major limits here, guys, is going to be straight up getting those fatty acids in the mitochondria. Hence why you see the idea of supplementing carnitine to help with fat metabolism and energy production. I've yet to see a lot of compelling evidence that shows that increasing the total amount of carnitine is really going to help. So notice the multi-step process where the fatty acid is now converted into fatty acyl-CoA, which through CPT1 is going to remove that CoA. However, it's going to bind to carnitine, which then through translocase come into the cell and be bonded back into acyl-CoA, where it can then go through beta oxidation. And then obviously carnitine is going to keep cycling on around. Now, every time we go through one round of beta oxidation, remember, we're going to be chopping off 2 of those fatty acids. It is only a 4-step process. It does not require a lot of activation energy otherwise. However, it needs to have enough downstream products to allow it to move accordingly. Specifically, oxygen being that final electron acceptor at the end of the electron transport chain. So when it comes to fats as fuels with exercise, notice, guys, at lower exercise intensities, we're going to have a pretty solid amount of fat metabolism. Right now, you guys are going to be utilizing mostly just fats as a fuel in order to keep yourself from passing out. Well, not passing out, just when you're not really doing any exercise, you've got such low demands, so you're not really having to utilize much fats at all. Now, it's as we go up in exercise intensity and duration potentially, but more of intensity, we're going to be relying more and more on carbohydrate. In fact, when we go at the same intensity for longer periods of time, in turn, we're actually going to see a greater reliance on fatty acids simply because we're starting to deplete that muscle glycogen. So fats are great because you're rarely ever going to deplete your intramuscular triglyceride stores and all of the fatty acids you can potentially get from the rest of your body, more so that you're going to deplete that glycogen. Because when you deplete that glycogen, guys, remember, we're only going to be able to produce energy at about 2/3 its previous rate, which means, just a simple, make it easy on your math, you're only going to be able to keep up 2/3 of your current pace, which is probably going to make you a pretty bad athlete. So notice here, guys, when we're at low percentages of our VO2 max, most of our energy is going to be coming from our plasma glucose and plasma fatty acids. As we are going to go ahead and now increase our exercise intensity, now you're starting to see, okay, muscle glycogen as far as a need is going to show up, as is we're going to increase the intramuscular demands of triglycerides. Notice you're actually getting a little less plasma fatty acids and more muscle or blood glucose. And then at even higher intensities, even more so, now we're really relying heavily on carbohydrates, and our total central amount of fat we're utilizing has now gone down. And like anything else, it's the intensity that's the key here. So fats are great at rest, and or if we're doing incredibly short bouts of exercise where we're going to have complete recoveries like Olympic lifting, shot put, disc, and things along those lines. Great fuel source. You don't really need carbs to do that. But if you're doing anything where you're trying to dominate in anything that takes more than 10 seconds and less than 4 hours, probably you're going to need a lot more carbohydrates. But remember, fats are useful as a way to allow us to preserve them. So, and what's interesting is it doesn't seem to be so much a problem with the availability of fatty acids. So lipid heparin is going to allow for a greater amount of fatty acids to be available, notice in the blood, But then when you're actually looking at fat oxidation, it doesn't actually increase that greatly. So like anything else, notice the units, guys, this is going to be millimole, and then this is micromole. So even though you've got well over an order of magnitude increase over here, you're barely even getting a 25% gain in fat oxidation. So the major issue is not the availability in the blood. Once again, it's just getting into the mitochondria, as well as being able to then break it down for, obviously, energy through the beta oxidation. So fat oxidation aerobic capacity, obviously, as you get to be more and more well-trained, you actually are going to be able to utilize slightly differing amounts of fatty acids. So you're actually going to be rely a little bit more on it at rest, and you be able to utilize it more so at a lower intensity. As far as the amount we're going to oxidize in our diet, whatever fuel you happen to be utilizing more often than the other, you're going to in turn start to use more of that at rest. So obviously, if you're eating a higher fat diet, you will in turn actually utilize fat more as a fuel. And like anything else, if we're taking in a lot of carbs, we're not going to utilize fats as much. Now, remember, this is another good method in order so we can go ahead and preserve it. So what we have here, guys, is a simple idea of utilizing medium chain triglycerides, which notice don't need a transporter to get into the cell, unlike long chain fatty acids. And when you actually give medium chain triglycerides, you don't actually seem to have that much greater of amount of energy breakdown as much as bulletproof coffee and other gimmicks, as we obviously had a fun conversation from a guest speaker about the efficacy there and how, like anything else, your body just uses whatever fuels are available, and it wants to be as efficient as it can be with the fuels that it has. So if you got a lot of carbs laying around, you're going to utilize those carbs. If you've got a lot of fats laying around, you're going to utilize those fats. Now, if you want to convert over to something like a ketogenic diet, which I know some of you guys did for your dietary modification homework, those of you guys that haven't done it yet and are having a mild panic attack, now that I said that, you're fine. Basic idea is I want you guys to go ahead and do something to modify your diet, meaning you can try a new type of dietary regime. You could try just increasing your hydration. You could try to not do so much caffeine. You could try to do all of the caffeine. Don't do all the caffeine. That's not really a healthy thing. But instead, or what you're going to do is, change up your diet in some meaningful way. Keep track of things like your sleep, your energy levels, your body weight, whatever values are going to be interesting and obviously relatively important to what you're looking at there. And then figure out, okay, did this actually improve my quality of life? And as reading through your assignments, yes, the ketogenic diet typically requires anywhere from a week to over a month for people to adapt to. So doing it in the short term is going to suck and you're going to feel like garbage. Other folks tried other dietary interventions where they felt great immediately, which is fine. The placebo's effect is one thing to be mindful of there, because it's easy to be like, I feel great. It's a placebo. Or you can also have a situation where people are like, oh man, I feel great now that I started this diet for 10 seconds. But what we're really looking at is more or less you just remove things from your diet that were probably not the best. That could be another major issue there, as well as when we're looking at are increasing our fiber rapidly. Unfortunately, your body has adapted only so much fiber. If you massively increase your fiber very quickly, you are going to have, you're going to easily get some diarrhea if you're not careful there. So keep in mind, certain dietary interventions work best acutely, where you can see a quick change. Others require chronic changes. So if you want to try to change your fundamental diet, doing it for 1 week is not going to give us good long-term data, obviously. Instead, following that for a couple months and saying, okay, what's the overall long-term effects on my health, my performance, my energy, things that I really care about. So now what we have here is a natural regulation between, are we going to utilize more carbohydrates or more fat given how much exercise we're doing? So whenever we are looking at any of these flow charts, remember, we've got a lot of different negative feedback, and this negative feedback is going to be related to what's referred to as the Randall cycle. So in situations where we've got very low amounts of energy in the cell, notice ADP, AMP, a lot of free phosphate and calcium, we're going to utilize carbohydrates a lot as a fuel, okay? And in turn, having not high enough amounts of acetyl-CoA levels, we're going to now convert more pyruvate into acetyl-CoA, which in turn is going to cause glycolysis to go faster. In the meantime, when we have epinephrine and calcium, higher levels inside the cell, meaning this, we're exercising, there's a little bit of stress, we're going to break down more fats and get them into the mitochondria. Now, as far as getting it in there, if we have a greater amount of melanyl-CoA because we're not breaking down as much fats, we have a greater amount of protons because we're in a more anaerobic environment, aka we're working at a higher intensity, and then obviously lower amounts of creatine in general, we're going to be slowing down this process. So naturally, between all the negative feedback mechanisms here, you can see as you increase that exercise intensity, initially when we just start to work out, both these cycles are going to be working, but if anything, you're probably going to be getting a little bit more out of the activity of fatty acids. But as we really ramp up that intensity, between notice, guys, that wonderful proton, and then definitely lower amounts of acetyl-CoA because we're burning through it a lot faster aerobically, we're naturally going to utilize carbohydrates as a fuel more so than we are going to be utilizing fatty acids. Now, this is looking at, notice muscle glycogen before and after whenever lipids are given. Notice it actually did have the ability to slightly help preserve muscle glycogen levels to a greater level than without doing this. But really, if you add calories in general to exercise intensity, and notice it's at 70%, we're going to be able to get something out of it. Now, if you happen to be doing the same thing, only at exercise more like 80, 90%, you're probably not going to be able to maintain that for long enough that you're really going to have that considerable amount of a difference. But when we're looking at glycogen preservation, and I know it's been 2 weeks since we've talked, the key thing is don't think about it matters just how much we have left at the end of this workout, but then how much we're even going to be able to restore before we have the following workout and before the workout after that. So if you're working with an athlete that has got to train twice per day, we really want to do everything we can to make sure that we're not going to be emptying that glycogen, because it is going to be very important for the performance. So yes, you can even give them peanut butter as a post-workout. A, because there's actually sugar in there, and then B, because there's going to be fat and some protein. Who cares? Give them calories. When we're thinking about giving folks nutrition as a means to help with recovery, if anything, we can have our perfect world ideas, then okay, what we have available around us, what we have available due to our budget and our time considerations. So yes, do I want my athletes eating spoonfuls of peanut butter with, I don't know, Pop-Tarts post-workout? No. In a perfect world, it would be a simple type of shake that's made up of really easily digestible carbohydrates along with simple essential amino acids, if not maybe some complete protein sources, to really allow for rapid recovery, ease of digestibility. But that costs money. So instead, peanut butter is pretty darn cheap. Pop-Tarts, pretty darn cheap. I'm sure somebody here has tried to dip a Pop-Tart in peanut butter. I know I have not, but I am very intrigued to know if that's any good, because Lord knows, that seems like one potential way to pound down some extra calories if you need them. So as far as the effects of fat supplementation and exercise, it doesn't really seem to help with performance whatsoever. You know, giving different types of long chains and medium chain triglycerides are not really going to help enhance performance acutely. Right now, there is some ketone supplements out on the market. This is different types of supplements that need to be essentially researched to a much greater level. And effectively what we're talking about, so beta hydroxybutyrate is one of them, where it's effectively a form of a fatty acid that is, you know, mostly metabolized, but hence why it's called the ketone body. Your brain can utilize it as fuel, your heart can utilize it as fuel, and your muscles can utilize it as fuel. And so ketone production is something that naturally happens whenever you are on a very low carbohydrate diet or you're starving. Now that's something that's fine. You can adapt to it. It's not the most enjoyable situation for a number of people. Some folks, because they're hypoglycemic or diabetic or other issues, should never even try it. But other folks play around with it. I'm sure you know at least one person on social media that says it's the greatest thing that's ever happened to them. And that's fine. Like anything else, when you find the dietary solution that works for you, by all means, go for it. Have a great time. Go have some fun. But understanding you still need to keep in mind everyone has a little bit of difference in how they metabolize different fuels, how quickly they adapt to different type of fuels, and who's going to tolerate it better than others. Now, one thing to keep in mind though, and this is our first little group part that we're going to have you guys do, is effectively we need to have a better understanding of effectively our 4 different classes of, you're all good, we'll see you when you get back, of the different types of fatty acids. So effectively, we've got saturated fatty acids, that's gonna be group 1. We have trans fatty acids, which is gonna be group 2. We have polyunsaturated fatty acids, which is gonna be group 4. Now, what I want you guys to do, and it's 6:21 right now, we're gonna give you guys until, we'll give you guys until probably just a bit before 6:30, where I want you guys to give me an example of effectively what are 2 different examples of a healthy form of those fatty acids. So for the poly group, when you're talking about, that's where you have your omega-3 fatty acids. But I'm going to talk about gamma-linoleic acid, which is actually an omega-6, but it is actually a little bit anti-inflammatory and has some positive effects on health, found in evening primrose oil and borage oil. So you're welcome. Now, when it comes to not so healthy, now we're going to talk about our typical omega-6, but I'm going to let them finish up that statement. So there are such things as healthy saturated fats, okay? That is a real thing, but we need to look at the individual fatty acids and the effects they can possibly have on your health. And there may or may not be one currently on their slide. So you can see that if you're in that group. Now the trans group, you're going to be really hard pressed to find the healthy ones, but I'll give you a hint, look up CLA. And hopefully from there, you're going to be able to encounter the other one, but the rest is just a dumpster fire. But understanding what are the healthy options. We're talking about the fatty acids, not the food sources, because food sources are going to have a variety of fatty acids. If you guys say salmon, like, yeah, salmon has omega-3s, has omega-6, has saturated fatty acids, has monos. Narrow it down. So we're really looking at what the individual fatty acids are going to have upon the health of the body. And then you can talk about the sources of them. But for now, we're going to kind of parse into it and what's the overall reoccurring themes that we're seeing there. Does that make sense to you guys? Do you need any more context before we put you guys in your first breakout rooms? Okay, seeing as how, I thank you, Kennedy, and I appreciate you showing up to class. Don't worry, she gets the joke there, guys. And when you guys are ready, go ahead and hop in your groups and get after it. And we will come back at 6:30, and if you guys need help, I'll give it to you. What you guys came up with. And good. Kennedy, yes, good work. Conjugated linoleic acid, positive potential effects on lean mass, decreasing fat mass. Also, the other one is vicinic acid, which is another potential positive effect. That's also going to be one found in more dairy as well. And then after that, all of trans fats are pretty much a straight up dumpster fire. Body doesn't have a great way to metabolize it. And so it's effectively causes a little too much rigidity in your cell membranes, which in turn is one of those things that helps lead to major negative health outcomes on your cardiovascular system. Excuse me. Good. What other groups do we got?
Our group had polyunsaturated fatty acids, and we just looked at the 2 different classes. So I'm going to post we didn't necessarily have individual examples, I guess. We talked about the different classes of polyunsaturated fatty acids.
So John, what about the 2, 4, 5, 7, and 9 polyunsaturated fatty acids then?
That is a good question.
It's okay. I have a master's in this stuff. When it comes to the major effects on health, absolutely. The hard schism line, and that's one thing that we're going to get into, is the omega-3 and omega-6 fatty acids. So yes. Good. Now, when it comes to omega-3s, alpha-linoleic acid is the one that we start off with. So notice I actually have that on the slide right here, guys. Now, the next form is eicosapentaenoic acid, also known as EPA. This is the omega-3 that's a little bit more anti-inflammatory. It's important for eicosanoid production, also can modulate cholesterol production inside the body. And then you got docosahexaenoic acid, DHA. Now, DHA is the one that's actually a big component of myelination in your brain. So DHA is a little bit more important for neurological function. And so that's why some folks are a big fan of fish oil supplementation, not just for cardiovascular positive effects, but also for some neurological effects. Though the research out there still has ways that are little ways it needs to go. Now, yeah, omega-6 is the other side of, okay. So your body naturally produces inflammation as a means to signal that areas need to have a little bit more turnover of cells and repair. So, you know, I lift weights nearly every single day, and trust me, I feel it today because there's a lot of inflammation currently in my wonderful posterior chain from deadlifting yesterday and lifting, other movements after that. Now, because of that, I'm having those localized immune reactions. The body is, in theory, sending a little bit more nutrients. We're having more nutrient turnover in that area, and we're hopefully repairing that muscle. Now, the key is if I keep sending more inflammatory signals to it, I'm going to keep having more swelling. I'm going to keep having more immune cell responses, and I can effectively start to tear down those cells, and we're having a little bit too much issue. So think about like when a joint swells up from too much training, too much exercise, and you can't hardly move it because of said inflammation. So, and that's just more cellular signaling. So eicosanoids, which are important for that signaling there, you're naturally having a bit of a battle between your omega-6 to your omega-3 ratio. And omega-6 being the more pro-inflammatory, which is not a bad thing because you need inflammation to tell your body to fix it. You don't want to have too much inflammation. So a way to think about inflammation would be the equivalent of if a building is on fire, you would like the fire department to come there and put it out, right? So we want the fire department to obviously apply enough water to put out said fire. Now, if we are, you know, let's say what's on fire is a little doghouse, okay? It's a little small wooden doghouse. And we go out there with a garden hose. That's probably adequate to put out that one little fire. Now, if I was to go and turn on like a real fire hose off of the fire hydrant and have that blasting into it, you know, yeah, we're going to put out that fire and we're probably going to destroy the doghouse. Okay. Now, if we turn on 20 hoses and fire them all at that little doghouse, not only are we going to do damage to the doghouse, we're going to have water damage in the surrounding area, and God knows what else is going to come. So we want to have just enough inflammation to resolve the issues, but not to blow them too far out of the water. Does that make sense to the inflammation comment or question that you had there, Kristen? Yep, palmitic acid. Good call, guys. That is not a good one. Caprylic and lauric are also great choices, and those are more of the medium chain triglycerides that you are going to get from eating things like coconut oil, hence why you see the caprylic acid in the coconut oil right there. Yes, Alex.
Oh, sorry, I'm muting myself by mistake. But I was going to ask you, what was the inflammatory one again?
Oh, that's going to be more of your, instead of your alpha-linolenic, it's your alpha-linoleic. That's your major omega-6 fatty acid.
That's omega-6. Okay, got it. Does omega-3 help with anti-inflammatory?
Yes, I thought that's what I said the entire time.
Okay, sorry. No, it's just kind of, I got it. Don't worry. Thank you.
No, go good, go good. Once again, guys, inflammation is not a bad thing. You want to have a certain amount. It's like having an immune response. You want to have an immune response, or the bacteria or viruses are going to literally eat you alive. The key is we don't want to have too much of a response. You know, overkill is never a good thing inside of your own body. So we want just the right amount. Okay, so Nathan, if you don't mind, can you post your guys again? Because I don't think the other groups can see what you posted. And remember, with John's group, we still want to hear specific names of those fatty acids. And yeah, great job again, Abby's group. Kennedy, you guys were kind of being screwed over because you're really hard pressed to find any healthy trans fats. So that one's meant to be really difficult. And then, good. When it comes to, awesome. Yeah, it's okay. It's okay. But the funny thing is, monounsaturated fatty acids are the ones that really don't have any unhealthy options. So of all the fatty acids to really overeat on and not really worry about, monos are actually probably your best bet. And if anything, if we're talking about peanut butter, like that's not a bad choice of where to go from, because that's where the vast majority of it is coming from. So, but notice guys, so it's 6:39 now, within 10 minutes, well, plus you guys doing your own research, so we'll say within 20 minutes, you guys now know the names of almost 12 different fatty acids, and there's a lot more out there. And so understanding that, yeah, so there's the EPA, but there's also and there's also DPA, and yeah, there's a lot of different types of omega-3 fatty acids. There's a lot more aside from lauric and caprylic. You got capanoic, and then, yeah, not just palmitic, but there's a lot of different ones, and all of them are gonna have different effects. Now, when you eat foods, they tend to be very mixed, but like I said, fats themselves are not the problem. It's more of the type of fatty acid we're taking in. And so since we put them in big buckets, but they actually work differently individually, it's important to understand we can't just combine them all into be the one same thing. So overall, if you have athletes go on a high fat diet, it doesn't seem to really help their performance. High carb is more the better way to go. This is just a normal diet as opposed to the high fat diet. And notice the endurance times is actually being able to maintain for performance in pure duration actually did seem to go up in the high fat diet, but that was actually more due to a greater amount of calories. When individuals are doing a short-term high-fat diet, just the extra calories sometimes helps them perform better, not so much the fat. Could be higher carb, higher protein probably wouldn't help you out either way. When it comes to long-term high-fat diet, sorry, Norbert decided he wanted to lay down, then he decided he wanted to get up. With the effects of a high-fat diet for the long-term, doesn't really seem to actually help performance that much. If you're like an ultra marathoner, or doing some type of crazy long distance events, you might want to play around with a really high fat diet. And specifically, if we're talking about periodizing your diet, which is a very, very high tier, rarely going to be used in an athlete you want to work with, where you're going to purposefully give them a phase of the year where they go relatively low carb, high fat. So they're going to have, in theory, a greater amount of mitochondrial biogenesis through the PGC1 alpha that we talked about in Advanced X Phys. And because of the increased amount of mitochondria, now we're going to be able to use aerobic fuel sources better in general. And then as we get closer to the races we care about, meaning like your marathon or your half marathon, your 5K, one of those type of durations, we're going to start to really uptick the carbohydrate intake as a means to enhance performance. Now, other folks utilize a ketogenic diet because when we deplete our muscle glycogen, remember we're storing water with it as well. For every 1 gram of carbs, we got about 2.7 grams of water. So if we can get rid of half a kilo of glycogen, well, now we're talking about losing almost an additional 1.5 kilos of water weight. So it's an easy way to make yourself a little bit lighter or to be in a lower weight class. So individuals like Olympic lifters, power lifters, some of those folks will play around with either acutely going low carb for like the week when they have to weigh in, or even doing this kind of all around the season. I've even heard of MMA athletes that go relatively low carb diet, and they typically will make sure that they're really on top of their carbohydrate supplementation pre-peri workout as a means so they can bolster up their exercise intensity then, but then the rest of the time have depleted glycogen so they're naturally at a lighter body weight. And since in a lot of those sports, having the better power weight ratio gives you an advantage, it is potentially something to look into doing. But you definitely don't want to go into it with having a good base of really what you're playing around with, because it is going to be hard on the body. Now, we've touched a little bit briefly on ketones, so I wanted to go ahead and make sure that we talked about this a little bit more. Now, cholesterol itself is something you can take in dietarily, and you should not be concerned about it. Very few people have the genetic predisposition to have a higher cholesterol level because of dietary cholesterol. Most of your cholesterol, guys, you're building inside of you each day, and that actually comes down to that balance between your omega-6 and your omega-3 fatty acids. So in general, the reason we care about cholesterol is because remember, all of our steroid hormones are based on it. So not just our estradiol and our testosterone, but our aldosterone and our cortisol are all going to be cholesterol-based hormones. If we don't have enough cholesterol, we're not going to have appropriate hormonal production. We don't have appropriate hormonal production. We're not going to have appropriate response to exercise, general health and wellness. Now, when it comes to ketones, so we can see as we're going through beta oxidation, if we effectively have that acetyl-CoA now, this in turn enzymatically is going to be catalyzed by thiolase, which gives us acetyl-CoA, and then HMG co-synthase, which is HMG CoA lyse. That's where we get into acetoacetate, which can convert into beta hydroxybutyrate, thanks to beta hydroxybutyrate dehydrogenase, literally just moving the water, or acetone. Ladies and gentlemen that are in the know, what is acetone? Nail polish remover. Good job, Kristen. So this is why people that are on a ketogenic diet or super low carb, their breath can start to smell a little sweet because they're actually producing this. Now, it's not so much that you're going to die from it. Ketoacidosis, which is going to be a bigger issue for people that are diabetic and having issues with inappropriate insulin or not getting enough of it, that's more of a bit of a problem. But having this natural amount or having ketone bodies is not necessarily a bad thing. Right now, like I said, it's very faddish and very, let's say, popular with a number of people to go ahead and try to use that. But that doesn't necessarily mean you need to go ahead and actually utilize ketone bodies for supplementation for performance. I haven't seen any lit yet that's compelling that says use it, but like anything else, it's still very much so on the R&D side. And then notice when we can take that acetyl-CoA through thiolase, HMG co-synthase, and then HMG co-reductase, making what's known as mevalonate, which in turn is going to eventually be converted into the flat out cholesterol. So we actually are going to build this. And part of the signaling is actually going to be the ratio of your omega-3 to omega-6 fatty acid intake. So that's why we talk about this being important also for cholesterol production. And cholesterol, aside from hormonally, is in turn going to actually be incorporated into your cellular membranes. It gives your cell membranes their integrity, so they're not going to fall apart too easily. In fact, that's why at the end of certain commercials for things like Lipitor and otherwise that are going to decrease your cholesterol levels, they throw out some of the side effects being sudden muscle pain or weakness. When that's occurring, that person is literally going through rhabdomyolysis because their muscles are now so weak and so fragile, they're falling apart from just going through basic activities of daily living, not even through strenuous training. So we need to have a certain amount of cholesterol. So don't be afraid of cholesterol in your diet, much less having a certain amount. Now, the key is the blood levels, which are going to be mostly controlled through exercise and a bit through your fiber intake, and then obviously your fatty acid choices, not so much the dietary cholesterol. Those are going to be the big things to stay on top of as far as indicators of overall health and performance. Now, in the bottom left here, guys, what we have is the combination of just the class and then the type of fatty acid that's found inside of it. So notice, guys, when we go from things like canola oil, we've got corn, we've got olive, we've got peanut, we've got beef tallow, palm oil, and coconut oil. We can see the sources of being saturated fats, monos, and polys. So you don't really get any oil that's purely one or another. And like I said before, your best bet is actually to go more with monos than a lot of different types of polys. Specifically, if we're going really hard in the omega-6s plus omega-6s, or any of your polyunsaturated fatty acids can rancidify, meaning go bad. And that's going to have even more detrimental effects. So we want to kind of avoid that to the best of our ability if we can. And so the last thing we're going to go ahead and do is divide you guys into groups again, though we're going to go ahead and move the groups around a little bit because I noticed we had somebody drop out. So we can go ahead and, oh, that didn't work at all. You know what? Screw it. Better idea. Okay. So we are not going to worry about example 2 here, guys. So this one is a non-issue. Instead, we're going to focus on examples 1 3, and 4. Okay. So what I want you guys to do in your group is you guys are going to go ahead and give us the food choices you would have your athlete take in a given day in order to get effectively all these grams of fats, and trying to make sure that we're getting in effectively mostly healthy options. So I don't want to hear that we're going to eat nothing but bacon, fried bacon with a side of butter. Instead, let's try to have a little fun, but give an idea of what's going to be the serving size, and otherwise that's going to get an adequate amount of fat throughout the day. God have mercy on how many times you guys are going to bring up avocados. Have fun, guys.
I automatically thought of avocados. Darn.
No. You guys have fun with it. Have fun with it. Just like, yeah, what's 100 grams of fat going to look like? How would you break that up over the meals? Don't worry about any of the other ones. It's 6:49. Just be ready to paste into the chat what you guys came up with. Plan on coming back at like probably a little bit after 6:55. And yeah, have some fun, guys. We'll see you guys back then.
May I ask a question about cholesterol?
Yeah, go for it.
Is there any reason then that people hear that we should have a low cholesterol diet, or is that more like an artifact from a previous science?
It's more of an artifact. Like, there are people that genetically do, if they have a high cholesterol diet, their cholesterol ramps up. So for them, damn straight, this is a great fit. It's kind of like when we had the conversation about salt in your diet, how most people salt doesn't really affect their blood pressure. Some people it really does. And then others, it's the opposite way you think. So instead, if that's the method that works, go ahead and do it. But if that's not necessarily working, then by all means, go ahead and, we'll change the diet however we need to get that person's cholesterol down. But usually exercise, adding fiber to the diet, and trying to make better fatty acid choices tends to really help most folks out.
Cool. Thank you.
And then we can always do drugs because we're Americans.
True.
All right, what's going on?
I couldn't remember which one we were supposed to be.
No worries. You guys are in group 3, if I remember correctly. So
Yes.
you guys are going to be doing 70 grams of fat for a vegan athlete who's allergic to nuts.
Okay.
Okay.
So, because that's the thing, if you're working with a vegan, and I swear to God, if you're just saying doing shot glasses of olive oil, I'm going to be closed out. Don't do that. But instead, think about like, okay, if we can't do fat from nuts, and that's the easiest thing to do as a vegan, what are our choices? Because not like broccoli's got a lot of fat in it, and animal products is an easy place to find fat. So you guys got a difficult one.
Okay. I was going to tell you too, Dr. Lane, I went back to look up like examples of a polyunsaturated fat, and I found like I guess it was like a chart of like different, like, I guess breakdown of like the linoleic into different, and like I searched on Google.
To us. When you guys are ready, go ahead and just get everything ready to paste in the chat until we see the numbers are back up. So just chill for a moment before we're gonna have you guys paste through what you guys came up with. Man, you guys are ready to hop out of that group. Other ones are like, nah. Okay, cool. All right, we got everybody back. So when you're ready, go ahead and paste in what you guys came up with, so we can talk our way through it and see what we all think. Nice. Yep, knew that avocado was going to show up somewhere. There you go. There you go. It's not bad. Notice for the choices you guys made, you probably get a decent amount of protein to go with it. So now it's just a matter of like, okay, where's going to be our, where are we going to get our carbohydrates from? All right. Where's our vegan carb list along with our ketogenic athlete?
I'm trying to find a dinner for the meal plan.
Yeah, I'm just trying to find like 2 sides because we're not at like 200 grams yet.
No worries. Be a side of butter with a little extra amount of butter. So while they're wrapping up, so a true ketogenic diet is 80 to 90% fat, and the remainder is divided up between carbs and protein. More modern people, when they say they're going keto, it's usually something more in the neck of like 20 to 40% protein. The rest of it's coming from fat. So a ketogenic diet typically is very, very heavy on dairy-based fats, along with obviously meat, and maybe a little bit of vegetables, not a whole lot there. Fiber doesn't, remember, metabolize as a carb, so you're okay. You're obviously not really eating any fruit, and say goodbye to every single sweet and the entire grain carb food group. You can live like this. It's potentially very useful in people that have drug-resistant seizures. Also shows some efficacy in being useful for folks that may or may not be undergoing things like cancer, just because some cancers really are very carbohydrate. They really utilize carbs as a fuel source. So if you remove the carb fuel source from them, they aren't able to grow and metastasize as rapidly. So, but at the same time, notice, guys, that's a lot of fat. And specifically, if you think about, that's going to be 1,800 calories worth of fat, and the rest will be pretty low. So notice, yeah, I gave you guys the allergic to nuts, and that's the easiest way to get fat, since we don't have the dairy group or the meat group to utilize for a vegan. And so, yep, avocado shows itself. Hooray! Chia seeds, good, and they're seeds, not nuts. So way to really walk thinly around that, along with flax seeds. So you could have your chia pet, or you can go ahead and have all those seeds, which are going to be so great to chew. And then nice. Now, cocoa nut is notice, nut. So unfortunately, you would potentially kill them if they're allergic to nuts with that snack there. That's okay. So usually legumes, so like beans and otherwise, that can be a decent source of fat that they can do. But obviously, you still got to be careful with individuals that have had those issues, and that's where they might be pounding avocados all day. Or we can go America and debag it and go with potato chips, because there's oil, fat on there, along with salt and a little bit of carbs, and they're vegans, so who cares? They can murder as many potatoes as they want and will never feel bad. And so, and we're even choosing keto bread, way to be on the nose, and a cheese waffle, which I have no idea what that is. Sounds interesting. Nice job, Abby's group as well. Yeah, works out pretty solidly. So you guys would hit all the needs you'd have to have, or that we've put out through here. Obviously not a diet that a lot of you guys, I think, would sign up for and having to do chronically, but like anything else, you got to have solutions to modern problems. So now let's go ahead and talk about the joys of protein. So we care about protein aside from trying to make you look swole, but also for the fact that protein is very important because we are constantly losing it every single day. We're going to take it in. It then becomes what's known as part of our free amino acids, usually in their bloodstream. From there, we're going to be breaking down or building up and breaking down proteins in our body every day. A little bit of it is going to be metabolized and oxidized, not much. It's more or less because of ubiquitin protease pathways, when things get broken down, it just gets sometimes metabolized out. Notice, and this is for graduate students, if I want to recreationally increase your blood pressure, memorize exactly into each of these steps where each of these individual amino acids is going to feed in. And notice some of them can feed in more than once, like phenylalanine, because of its giant R group, it gives it more options. But this just gives you an idea of how we're converting through, and then amino acids can be brought into various steps of the citric acid cycle, and even notice some into pyruvate. So that means it can actually go through gluconeogenesis. Specific alanine is usually the major one there. So amino acids, for the most part, are just going to be traveling around the body as the individual amino acids. Now, we're going to take them in typically as complete proteins. We're going to be breaking them down through all of our diffs, from pepsin to our trypsins, and then we're going to break them down into those individual amino acids on the brush border, some dipeptides, some tripeptides. And from there, we're going to ship them wherever they need to be. Now, they're going to be metabolized usually through anabolism, so being put together into full protein complexes. Sometimes they're going to be synthesized into different components. For example, your pyrimidines and your purines are going to be parts of your DNA. So we're talking about my gosh, guanine, cytosine, thionine, uracil if we're doing with RNA, and adenine. So that's what's actually coming from. Your neurotransmitters, for the most part, are coming from glutamate, which is more of an excitatory, tyrosine, which is going to be important for epinephrine, and tryptophan, which is going to be important for, of all things, your serotonin production. Now, methionine is important for choline, which is important for neurological function. Think acetylcholine, also a neurotransmitter. And serine is just another amino acid. Tyrosine is also important. Notice for your T3, T4. And creatine itself is going to be synthesized from a combination of arginine, glycine, and methionine. So glutathione, remember, that was the major antioxidant. I'm sure you guys all have your thoughts about histamine and histamine blockers whenever your allergies come. And carnitine was coming from lysine, which was, remember, how we get those fatty acids into our cells. So we're going to synthesize them thanks to the joys of RNA transcription and translation, where it's being bound up to the particular transporter RNA, and through the rRNA reading off of the mRNA, we are going to get everything put together. So that will then go through, that's the primary sequence, which then folds into the secondary sequence, which then folds into the tertiary sequence, and then combines with other proteins to make the quaternary sequence. Don't worry about it. It's things that I had to learn in grad school. Just hope you never have to take advanced biochemistry. So now, why we care is right over here, okay? Every single day, we are secreting a lot of different protein in the form of enzymes for breaking down not just different proteins, but also breaking down, remember, our amylases for our carbohydrates and our lipases for our fats. We also are going to then break down a decent amount of that. Some of that we are going to lose is just fecal waste. So if a 90-gram protein intake plus the natural secretions we're going to have is going to net us 150 grams of protein, okay? This in turn, some of it's going to be broken down and just metabolized out as just part of the nature of our body going through calories, so you can see the urine waste. Now from there, notice the amount of protein synthesis in a given day. Your white blood cells are using about 20 grams. Your red blood cells, specifically building more hemoglobin, because we're constantly replacing our red blood cells and our white blood cells, is using about 8. Our albumin, which is going to be that protein that's very important for the onconic pressure. Remember, it also is going to help with binding up certain hormones and free fatty acids for transport around the body, and other general blood proteins. We're talking about another 20 combined. And then we've got the natural turnover that's going on inside of our digestive system, our lungs, our liver, our brain, etc., and then our muscle itself. Now, notice all of this is adding up to a grand total of 250 grams. Luckily, we are not actually having to chew through new protein every single day. As different protein sequences are broken down into those free amino acids, they can be reincorporated, think about like Lego blocks, into new proteins inside of the body. And so since we're constantly breaking things down and building things up, we need to make sure that we're taking in adequate amounts of protein. Now, does that mean you need to take in a meal every 6 hours? No. Now, if we're trying to optimize for lean mass, trying to optimize for performance, now we're going to have some different considerations with how we're going to get that protein in, and effectively the choices we're going to make throughout the day. But just remember, we naturally have turnover. Another thing to keep in mind here is also you're losing skin cells every day, and you're also losing hair. Now, some of us faster than others because we're getting older, more the boy hair than the man hair, but it's still going to be obviously a frustration of what happens as you get older. Anyways, so this is just giving us the basics of how a number of different amino acids are going to be degraded, the different products. Notice transamination to form glutamate, meaning literally by removing the amine group from alanine to glutamate, we now can create and convert into pyruvate, into oxyl acetate, ketones, succinate, etc. Those were those in-betweens that you guys saw earlier. This is effectively going to be how we're being able to convert from one to another. Now, the reason we care about protein degradation and effectively being able to go and convert from one to the other is this gives us the basic concept where we have our essential amino acids and our non-essential amino acids, because we can effectively convert from one thing to another in a number of cases, not all of them. And so in those cases where we can't, that's where we need to get those amino acids in our diet. Otherwise, we are not going to be able to maintain. Now, the reason we care about protein and amino acid turnover is we literally are going to care about how much lean mass we have. So this is that question that you guys had about the wonderful nitrogen balance, which we're going to get into a lot more in a bit. But first, we need to effectively figure out how much you happen to be losing. So we can look at the urea concentration in both your sweat and in your urine itself. Easy to collect, but it doesn't always give us a major effect of how much you're turning over. In how much you're retaining, it's just, okay, if you're taking in a lot of protein, you're going to have more in your urine and have more in your sweat. Now, there's the 3-methylhistidine levels in urine, which is going to be a good indicator of myofibrillary breakdown, but it's still only a rough estimate. And like anything else, we need to be mindful of how much meat someone's taking in the first place, because they'll get this from eating meat in general. And it's not really telling us how we're changing our muscle mass. Now, nitrogen balance, which we're really interested in doing, is going and looking at truly how much nitrogen is coming in and then how much is going out. Now, why we care about it? Because if you're in a nitrogen surplus, that means you are going to be accruing nitrogen, aka it's the only protein is the only macro that has nitrogen incorporated into it, which means we're gaining some form of lean mass. That could be you're getting longer fingernails. That could be your hair is getting really long. That could be you have somehow gotten a lot thicker skin, or it could be because you're increasing your muscle mass. That's where we still need to do body composition tracking and otherwise to get an idea what's going on. Same thing, we could be losing lean mass. That could be you're losing hair, losing skin, losing nails. That sounds like it's going to hurt like hell. And or obviously decreasing your muscle mass, your connective tissue. Collagen protein is the major component of your connective tissues. And that's why collagen supplementation in theory has a little bit of a positive effect on helping you repair your connective tissues. Now there's arterial venous measurements, which is awesome, where you literally put an IV line in the artery, put another one in the vein, and then we're actually able to see literally how much of different individual amino acids are going to be taking up into that area. Usually it's looking at phenylalanine. You can use radio labeled isotopes. So this is going to be individual amino acids that are actually radioactive, and you can literally see how much is going to be taken up and brought in. And then there's the stable isotopes, which are going to be different in weight, which you can still measure, but we don't have to worry about the potential health risk of radiation. And like anything else, we can do that true fractional synthesis rate and breakdown rate, which is you can literally figure out how much amino acids are being taken up into a given cell type. Usually a lot of people are looking at protein, and then how we're going to have that turnover into protein. Now, all of these are interesting ways to do it. The easiest way to do this, hands down, guys, is just track body comp. Track body comp through a consistent measure and using consistent testing methodology and see how it changes with time. So if their lean mass is increasing, then they're going to be in a nitrogen surplus. Congratulations, you're doing a great job, everybody. And or if they're losing lean mass, congratulations, you're in a deficit. Now, obviously, we can be taking in more than enough protein, but because we're in such a big caloric deficit, we're not able to maintain our lean mass. And at the same time, we can be in a major caloric surplus, but we're not taking enough protein to support increasing lean mass. And now we're just gaining, well, we're getting a lot fluffier. That's the nicest way we can term it, which, you know, there's time and a place for each of those things. And it's probably something most people aren't really interested in. Now, as far as our recommendations for exercise, here it is. If we're talking about an endurance athlete, we're really talking about somewhere between 1.2 and 1.5 grams of protein per kilogram of body mass per day. Now, when we're talking about a strength athlete, now we're going at about 1.5 to 1.8 grams of protein per day. And when we're talking about athletes that are trying to avoid effectively losing lean mass while they're in caloric restrictions, that's where we're going to see it get up to, I've seen the literature allude to as high as 2.5, but more recent research by Jose Antonio and his group has literally had people taking 4 grams of protein per kilogram of body mass per day with no major negative health outcomes after a year of living like that. So just because we happen to be taking in greater amounts of protein does not necessarily, it's not the death sentence that some people are going to try to tell you. I'm sure some of you guys have heard the old wives' tale of, high protein is going to kill your kidneys. And that's just not the truth. Now, if you already have kidney failure or kidney problems, you do a high protein diet, hell yeah, you already got kidney failure, you got big issues. But we don't want to go and try to pump a bunch of amino acids through you because the body really doesn't do well with that. What's the difference between keto and carnivore diet? Carnivore diet is people that are only eating meat. The keto diet is obviously specifically relying on ketogenic sources. The keto is kind of the new fad. I have a lot of issues with it just because of the fatty acid sources. I don't think is probably the best for long-term vascular health. But the problem with any diet, guys, when it's successful for that individual, they tend to become very evangelical about it. Like everyone should do what I'm doing. I actually had someone earlier today, one of my coworkers, who was asking a question for a friend, and they're like, what's your thoughts on doing the intermittent fasting diet? And I was like, it's another way to cause you to change your diet. Remember, guys, the big key of how you're going to change your body weight is literally being a caloric deficit. That's it. Whatever puts you in the deficit is going to get you there. So I want to patent this, and I guess now I'm putting it on the internet, so this will be a record of, it's the 23-59-1 diet. It's going to cause anyone to lose weight. It's a form of intermittent fasting where you're only allowed to eat for 1 minute a day. After that 1 minute a day, you can drink plain water, but you cannot eat any other food. You can have no more calories. I promise you, you will lose weight. That 1 calorie, I don't even care if you have a funnel and a bottle of olive oil. Well, maybe you could get enough calories that way, but you probably feel really sick from it, and otherwise that you wouldn't be able to keep it up. So congratulations, you're now going to lose weight because you're starving yourself. So we're looking at different ways to put ourselves into a deficit. Some folks, like the carnivore ketogenic, is where we're removing macronutrients, just like there's the low fat, high carb, high protein. That's just another way of removing a macronutrient. Then we've got a time element. Maybe we only eat 2 meals per day. Maybe we try to eat a lot of meals per day. We're looking at something along those lines. And then obviously we can eliminate food group, which is also going to be part of going into things like the paleo diet, where it's like we're not doing processed grains, dairy's out the window and otherwise. And, it's fine. If that's what works for you, you're not just following your health, but you're getting some blood biomarkers looked at and everything. Make sure you're not having any types of vitamin mineral deficiencies because you're not getting in a good mixed diet, then all power to you. But the big key is, like anything else, guys, it's finding a diet that is sustainable, something that you enjoy, something you don't mind, something that you're going to be able to keep up for the long haul, because most diets fail. Most people are going to finish the diet and they're going to gain the weight back. And a lot of them are going to overshoot where they're at beforehand. So doing things like hard intermittent fasting, ketogenic, carnivore diets, it's not necessarily going to be sustainable for a lot of people. And it's important to understand that what works for some people to get them into that caloric deficit might not work for you. And not to mention, you might not feel that good. Who cares about how great you look if you have no interest in doing anything other than thinking about food all day? In fact, there's some interesting starvation studies where the way that the people would write in their diaries about food was getting downright close to being a little too sexual, if you catch my drift. Like they were really, really thinking about food 24/7. And that's just not a good way to live and a good way to be happy. And I don't know, maybe I'm getting old, but I'd rather be happy than ripped. And at the end of the day, live your own dream. So what we can definitely say that when we're doing endurance training, not only are we going to be depleting our muscle glycogen levels, but we're also going to be doing damage to our connective tissues and our muscles themselves. So by the nature of the beast, we're going to need to increase our protein intake over the amount that Homer Simpson needs. Now, notice our intramuscular signaling pathways on the right. We've got phosphoinositol 3 kinase going into AKT, also known as protein kinase B, tumor skeletic protein 1. We've got ERK1/2, which is important for energy production in the cell. Notice the ATP to AMP, which activates AMP kinase, and then PGC1 alpha, which is that mitochondrial biogenesis and building all of those enzymes and other proteins important inside of a mitochondria requires protein. So like anything else, when we're doing resistance training, now we're talking about FOXO and MRF-BOX inhibition is going to actually be stopping catabolic pathways, mTOR, which affects protein 76 S6 kinase, and eukaryotic initiating factor binding protein 4EBP1, and G6 or GSK3 in turn are all going to go and cause increased amounts of hypertrophy in the cell through increasing myofibrillar content and sarcomeric content. So like anything else, or sarcoplasmic hypertrophy would be what we're talking about, we are going to need more protein simply because we are literally turning it over. We're doing damage to it, and then the body is trying to get better. Now, remember, it's going to be in the muscles we're utilizing, okay? And the fibers within inside of that muscle fiber, we happen to be actually contracting to get us to do that work. So how we're going to affect our protein intake, or how our protein intake is going to affect our synthesis, the best way to think about it, guys, is going to be how you're going to split this up over your given day, which is every time after you have a protein meal. Notice the green, we're talking about being in synthesis. When we're in the red, we're talking about being a little bit more in synthesis, and then over here, we're a little bit more in catabolism. So if our goal is to try and optimize our protein synthesis, we actually want to pulse our protein. By doing it all at the same time, you're not going to have as much of an effect on performance. So if you have just like one massive meal, it doesn't just hold you up for a while, and taking it all the time doesn't do the effect. Instead, it seems to be pulsing is the best way to do it. And notice this is Schoenfeld from a review, I believe it was from like 20, at this point it's getting kind of old, it might be like 16, 17, where effectively looking at research is the difference between having one protein meal to 2 protein meals for muscle building per day is pretty marked. Now going from 2 to 3 was much smaller. From 3 to 4 was smaller still. And then from 4 to 5 was pretty much negligible. So if we're really trying to maximize lean body mass, we probably want to take in 4 meals that have protein per day with at least 20 grams of protein. In the younger individuals, that's more from Tipton's work. That seems to really saturate out the curve of muscle building. It looks like this. So like 0 grams, 5, 10, 20, and then 40 isn't really much higher. That seems to be where you're going to maximize anabolism. Mind you, this is more recreationally trained people, not really highly trained. There's still a lot more research that needs to be done. But your best bet, if you're really, like I said, trying to get swole, it's making sure you're getting enough protein throughout the day. Now, ingesting it with some carbohydrates, because remember, that's going to be important for anabolism as well, and glycogen recovery, so you're going to be able to train harder more frequently. Sodium, potentially some other nutrients, and then we can also throw in some creatine, but we'll get about supplements later on in the class, is probably going to be your best bet. So notice here, guys, with net phenylalanine uptake, so this is going to be getting into synthesis, just carbs increase this, as opposed to amino acids did more so, but it was a combination of carbohydrates and amino acids. It was an even greater anabolic response. So questions there. And we say complete, now we're talking about an animal protein. We're not talking about us taking in an amino acid, individual amino acid, and especially if you're going to take in things like branch chain amino acids, you're missing all of the other amino acids that are very important for building protein. So we want to pick complete proteins when we can as a means to increase that muscle anabolism. So as far as the ability to be an ergogenic aid, it doesn't really seem to be working too well, okay? Now, the reason we say this is simply because, yeah, if you guys can see, we've got manufacturers' claims, but when you're actually looking at the literature, it doesn't really seem to have that type of an effect. There might be a little placebo effect. It was interesting. There was some hypothesizing that increased branch chain amino acids. So we're talking about leucine, isoleucine, and valine. which, don't get me wrong, leucine is very important for mTOR activation, but it's equivalent of saying we've turned on all of the machines that we need to build a building, but we don't have all of the bricks, the mortar, the metal, the rebar, the drywall, and everything else to build the building with. So leucine is equivalent of we turned on the machines and we've got electricity. That doesn't mean we actually have bricks. Doesn't mean we have mortar. And that's why you need all of your essential amino acids to really have a positive effect. Now, in theory, as we're exercising, we're increasing our serotonin production, which in turn is going to be linked to fatigue. Oh yeah. Now, every single gram of protein that you take in is going to be utilized. You don't waste really any of it. Anyone that tells you do anything over 30 grams in a meal is wasted is an idiot, and you shouldn't listen to them. Now, the problem with it is more or less once we go over high enough amounts, we don't really seem, it's not going to give you much more of a reward when it comes to metabolism. So I talked about that Jose Antonio et al. Research, where it didn't really increase the abilities of individuals as far as their lean mass. It seemed to actually cause them to actually lose a little bit of fat mass, but they didn't gain an appreciable more amount of lean mass compared to the control groups in there. So you can go higher in protein, but it's not going to make you gain any more muscle unless you're using a lot of drugs. And it's probably not going to do any negative things for your health. So if you like protein just because you enjoy eating those types of food, which I'm one of those people, then go for it. It seems to be the one that you can overeat and you don't have to worry about getting fat off of it. So that's kind of cool. But as far as, yes, once you take over a certain amount, it's not going to be too useful. Now, the reason I say the 20 grams in one sitting is because there's a big difference in body size between a 100-pound gymnast, a 200-pound, wide receiver, and a nearly 350-pound lineman. Now, they all carry different amounts of lean body mass. They all have obviously different amounts of protein they're turning over in the body due to those sizes. So you can obviously go higher. The problem is the research is using a bunch of recreationally trained, relatively normal college students. So it's not going to tell you like, okay, how many grams of protein does Halfbore Thorson, does Brian Shaw do, insert all of those individuals who a lot of them are using drugs, really need in order to obviously maximize not just muscular size, but recovery and performance. So taurine's a fascinating one in that more recent research seems to actually have a positive effect with actually decreasing of all things cramping. Seems to help a little bit with electrolyte balancing, but that's more research that needs to go a bit further as well. Oh, also with glycine, what's fascinating, it seems to also help a little bit with actually helping people relax at night because it competes with glutamine. So you're not making as much glutamate and otherwise it's stimulating. Yeah, massive dosages of glutamine in theory are supposed to help a little bit with immune function because it turns out it's a big component of skeletal muscle as well as your immune system utilizes it a lot extensively. But same thing, the research out there for really increasing performance isn't quite there yet. So yeah, protein intake and health risks. It's not really an issue. It really isn't. So here's one of Jose Antonio's papers. Women using it, no negative effects on bone mineral density anywhere in the body, no issues with kidney. Obviously, another research study looking at effects of protein on kidney function, not really a thing either. So, like anything else, guys, protein is not going to be something you can just take in massive amounts and all of a sudden you're going to be just massive and huge. However, it's also nothing to be really worried about and concerned. But like anything else, we just want to make sure we're getting it within certain levels we're looking for an athlete. So our last little group, so we're going to go ahead and we are going to have you guys in 4 groups again. Okay. We're going to have a little fun here. I want you guys to go through and remember, for most of these athletes, it's going to end up being at least 4 meals that we're trying to do. Okay. You've got the protein amounts of grams you're going to need to get in over the course of that day. Okay. And so we're trying to divide it relatively evenly. So in a perfect world, if you're working with an athlete, we definitely want to have some type of breakfast, some type of lunch, some type of dinner, and some type of pre-bed protein snack, and then potentially a post-workout snack if that doesn't already naturally kind of time up with one of those previous meals to really help with effectively anabolism to the best of our ability. Now, when I say Lacto-Ovo Vegetarian, do you guys know what that means? Okay, Lacto-Ovo Vegetarian means you're a vegetarian who will only, but who will actually enjoy or milk products and eggs. Okay. So, and then pescatarian, we're talking about how pescatarian is just fish. That's the only one you're going to do. Just remember, as an American, guys, we will only eat wet bugs. We will never eat dry bugs. Crickets, no way. Shrimp, yes. Cockroaches, never. Sea cockroaches, yes. Lobsters. All right. Have some fun, guys. It is 7:31. Plan on coming back at about 7:40. You ready to go? Get after it. Go ahead and paste into the chat what you guys came up with for the protein and protein sources for your given example. And obviously do try to let us know what group you had, so you can see that too. One cup of turkey bacon. Nathan, have you ever had turkey bacon? That stuff is garbage. And how much Italian sausage would that be for 42 grams of protein? Snack is just a simple 4.5 ounces of pork tenderloin. I like it. Lunch, 4 thighs of barbecue chicken. Salad, 12-ounce sirloin steak. Does not sound like a bad fate for anybody. Okay. I think there'd be a fat load to it, so I don't know if it would net you. There'd be more Italian sausage than just the 42. That's okay. That's okay. That's why we talk through it. Even things like, protein powder, unless you're doing like pure amino acid powder, you're never going to meet a gram for gram equivalent. So that's okay. But solid work on your strength athlete who's eating all of the protein. All right. So we got some toast with peanut butter and we're eating some eggs. Nice. Don't know if pescatarians do eggs, but we've got that option. Definitely doing the salmon as a good choice. Ooh, and Greek yogurt. Fancy. Man. You're doing a cup of chickpeas. Woo! You're also not afraid to go a little high in the fiber. And that sounds good, Chris. And at the same time, the fish and black bean tacos on top of the chickpeas, you are loading them up for fiber. So I can surmise what's the first thing they need to do when they wake up in the morning. All right. So vegans can't do Greek yogurt because that's definitely dairy. But you definitely can do almonds and tofu, and then, yeah, a lot of quinoa. Absolutely, Kennedy. But instead of doing the Greek yogurt, yeah, if you're really nuts are going to be your best bet for high protein. Obviously, you could use some type of, legumes, they've got decent protein, but then you're throwing in some fiber with it. Nuts, same type situation. You're getting mostly fat to go with it, but you're obviously getting some protein, but that's gonna be a bit more challenging. And so, yeah, I think we're just looking for our Lacto-Ovo Vegetarian. So doing some pancakes and cottage cheese. Just living the dream, aren't we, Alex? Half a box of black beans soy pastes.
I meant to write pasta.
Pasta. Okay. I was like, here's your sad half box of black bean paste. Crying while eating. Vegan chicken protein mix. Oh God. You know, that's a solution. You could just do a whole lot of eggs. Like that's an option. And then, you know, milk itself doesn't have, you know, it's not bad yields. Cottage cheese is a great choice when you're talking about trying to get in. Then you can obviously look at different types of yogurts and otherwise as options. So yeah, altogether, not a bad setup. And you guys see how you're kind of trying to divide it over the course of the day, given obviously what the individual is trying to do. So does anybody else have any questions, comments, concerns about proteins or fats? Obviously, we covered a lot of information as per the usual in a relatively short period of time. You know, hence the expectations. You're going to be looking at your books outside of class, looking at the notes before we get here, and then we take it from there. But does anybody else have any other questions, comments, concerns? Otherwise, we are done for the day. Make sure you guys are staying on top of your homework assignments, the quizzes, and then obviously the papers and the energy metabolism project are all coming down the pipe. And so we will be lecturing next week, and then you guys are going to be going on to the next exam. So I talk about hydration, how you should make sure you drink water. It's really useful. Questions, comments, concerns?
Yeah, real quick, Dr. Lane, I'm sorry. Is that all this stuff? It's like, I'm like an information overload, and I just want to make sure I'm not getting myself confused. When it comes to mono unsaturated and poly unsaturated fat, why are those good for us in a sense?
So it's not, okay, good question. Don't think of it along the lines of saturated fats are bad. Most trans fats are all very bad, except for really safe two of them, vicinic acid and conjugated linoleic acid. With the key is different fatty acids have different physiological effects on the body. So your monos, all your fats can serve as obviously energy sources. That's again, we can break down all these for energy. Now, the saturated ones, they have the most saturation with carbon, meaning they literally give you the greatest amount of energy yield when you break them down. So hence why that's how we like to store it, is saturated fatty acids. Now, fatty acids are also incorporated into your cellular membranes. And the amount of effectively those points of saturation, the kink it has in the line, that has a little bit of effects on cellular signaling to a certain extent. And it also has an effects on the appropriate amount of rigidity to your cell membranes and then flexibility to your cell membranes. We want your cell membranes to be flexible enough that they actually can move, because obviously our cells have elasticity. They're going to move around as we go. And if they're brittle, then they just tear when you try to move just a little bit. And that's obviously not what we're looking for. Now, your cell membranes also need to have enough rigidity that I pull and all of a sudden my skin comes right off and slides on the floor. Like that would be something like out of a horror film. Now, it's not just your skin. That's also going to be things like your arteries, your capillaries. We want to have a certain amount of flexibility in those cells around your arteries. And that way we're going to be able to dilate and constrict, and we're going to allow blood to pass through there. And that clots, part of that is that inflammation, localized damage, plaques can develop over there as a way to kind of patch it up as kind of an internal Band-Aid. But then if we keep adding more plaque on top of that, partially due to calcification, so that has ramifications when we talk about vitamin K, and specifically when we look at it in the concepts of triage theory, as well as obviously higher cholesterol, having more of the cholesterol that's available to bind there in the first place. And so we want to think about our fatty acids have positive effects because they're incorporated into structures as well as being an energy source. Carbohydrates are not really incorporated into structures so much. They're just mostly, ribose. That's a 5-carbon sugar, and that's the basics of deoxynucleic acid, or deoxyribonucleic acid, DNA, and ribonucleic acid, RNA, ribose in between each of those. Pretty important to have that carbon, or have that carbohydrate. Whereas all of your cell membranes all of your cells are wrapped in fat. So if we don't have the fat wrapped around there, now we can have a lot of issues with, once again, what type of fat is it made up of? Is it too rigid? Is it too flexible? Hence why cholesterol is important also in the mix there, because it does give a certain amount of rigidity to it. And again, the signaling effects and how it's important for endogenous cholesterol production, which also is important for hormones, and so on and so forth. Wow, that was long answer long. Did that make sense? Or did I pull a Billy Madison at the end of the movie there?
I think that all made sense. Thank you.
Yeah, no worries. Way to be the bitter enders, guys, because we started with 14 and we ended with 9. Been a hell of a war of attrition tonight, guys. So stay safe out there. Any other questions you guys want me to go ahead and cover or talk about before we call it a night?
I had a quick question real quick, Dr. Lane. I was going to ask about fat storage. So I understand that when people are in a caloric surplus, to convert with excess calories they have into fat and store it. But I know some people have different locations where the fat is stored in adipose tissue. Is there some kind of relationship where that fat will be stored? No, some people have more visceral fat, some people have fat in other locations. There's some kind of relationship about where that's stored.
So long story short, genetics. Long story long, a combination of hormonal profiles for individuals. So individuals who maybe have issues with insulin signaling and otherwise, or especially folks that have been on large amounts of prednisone and otherwise, really high cortisol levels, they tend to be more of that American pregnancy. Testosterone, sorry, that's through the belly is what I refer to as the American pregnancy. And it can also be things like high amounts of testosterone tend to make you carry most of your body fat through the midsection. Estrogen seems to be more causing you to carry it along the hips and thighs. Charles Poliquin, he's since passed, he came up with an entire theory that your body fat deposition is related to your hormonal profile. I'm not sure how much stake I put in that. But at the same time, yeah, you've got genetics, and then you've got the wonders of lifestyle stressors and factors around you that is going to influence. I mean, that's why some folks, are relatively lean, yet they've got 2 chins. Other folks are relatively lean and they seem to just carry it all in their hips and their thighs. It's good old genetics. It's the reason why, different people can have different builds thanks to mommy and daddy. So yeah, does that answer your question there, John?
It does. I thought about genetics. I'm sure it does play a big part. Now there's other things besides that could influence it. So
yeah, so I mean that's a lifestyle and stress. So people that are constantly bathed in cortisol, they're naturally going to probably have a lot more central adiposity as well.
That makes sense.
Mm-hmm. It's a beer belly. All your bros drinking too many. So, all right, guys. Well, stay safe out there. Take care of yourselves, and I will see you guys in lecture next week. So, bye-bye.